It's time to begin our services this evening. If everyone will, let's turn to page 202. Page 202. And after the psalm, I ask Lee, if you will, lead us in a word of prayer. 202. Beyond this land of parting, losing and leaving, far beyond the losses, darkening this, and far beyond the taking, and the bereaving, lies the summer land of bliss, land beyond, so fair and bright, land beyond, where is no night, summer God is its light. Oh, happy summer land of bliss. Beyond this land of toiling, sowing and reaping, far beyond the shadows, darkening this, and far beyond the sighing, moaning and weeping, lies the summer land of bliss. Land beyond, so fair and bright, land beyond, where is no night, summer land, God is its light. Oh, happy summer land of bliss. Beyond this land of waiting, seeking and sighing, far beyond the sorrows, darkening this, and far beyond the pain and sickness and dying, lies the summer land of bliss. Land beyond, so fair and bright, land beyond, where is no night, summer land, God is its light. Oh, happy summer land of bliss. Let's pray.
Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you in prayer, thanking you for this wonderful day you bless us with, this opportunity you've given us to gather here this evening and study from your word. It's our prayer that you be with the ones that are teaching this evening, that they will teach material in a way that's easy to understand. Be with the ones listening, that we will listen with our fullest attention, open hearts, be able to take what we learn this evening and make application to our lives and help us become better Christians. We pray that you be with the ones that are unable to be with us this evening, that you be with them and help them be able to return next coming time. Father, we pray that you continue to be with this congregation we have here, that we may continue to grow and strengthen in number, that you will always help guide and direct us. We ask for forgiveness of our sins. I pray in Christ's name. Amen.
If you would, mark your psalm books at page 292. 292 will be our psalm after class. And we'll go to our classes.
Okay. Well, tonight we are going to do an overview of the book of Ruth. It's kind of the last in the semi-poetry, wisdom, literature section. So I want to do that before Lynn will start his class, I guess actually 3 weeks from now. There we go. I'll pull up this video. Microphone's doing the cutting in and out thing. That's annoying. Wonder why that is. Okay, so we'll do this. And drag this over here. Forgot to turn the volume up back there. I'll be right back.
Question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are three main characters in the book: Naomi the widow, Ruth the Moabite, and Boaz the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line: "In the days when the judges ruled." And it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi. And she says, "Wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God." And so the two of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her, that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up, and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman of Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out, at the last minute, Boaz discovers there is a family member who's closer to Naomi than he is, and he's actually eligible before him to redeem the family. But at the last second, this family member finds out that he's going to have to marry Ruth, the Moabite, and so he declines. But Boaz, remember, he knows Ruth's true character, and so he acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. And so just at the beginning, how Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. The story concludes with a reversal of all of the tragedies from chapter 1. So the death of the husband and the sons is reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to Naomi. And this symmetry between the opening and the closing, it's even more remarkable. So remember, the opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. And that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. And this symmetry, it highlights the design of the internal chapters as well. So each of the chapters begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future, and that's followed by a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz, and each chapter concludes with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taken place. This story is beautifully designed, and that design actually connects with a really interesting feature of the story, and that's how little God is mentioned. Right, the characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator actually never once mentions God doing anything directly in the story, and that's its brilliance. Because God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story, weaving together the circumstances and choices of all these characters. So Naomi, her tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her, but actually the whole story is about God's mission to restore her and her family. And he's doing so through Ruth, through her boldness and loyalty, which brings healing to Naomi's life, but not without Boaz, who's a no-nonsense farmer who's full of generosity and loyalty. And so God uses his integrity combined with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. And so this story brilliantly explores the interplay of God's purposes and will with human decision and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. And that leads to the real end of the story. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, showing how Boaz and Ruth's son, Obed, was the grandfather of King David, from whom came the lineage of the Messiah. And so all of a sudden, these seemingly mundane, ordinary events in this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. And so the book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of our lives as well. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about. The book of Lamentations. It's a unique book in the Old Testament that contains five poems from an anonymous author who survived.
Stop talking. There we go. Is that too loud? Good? All right, good deal. All right, so the book of Ruth is what we're going to be talking about tonight, and I learned a lot about it there in the video for the Bible Project. I really like that website a lot. Not from people that are part of a Church of Christ or anything like that, but there's a lot of really good stuff on there. More that I discovered even this past week that I'm excited about to dig into. I, as part of preparing for this study tonight, I was watching other people teach through the book of Ruth. One of them is my brother-in-law's father, and I asked him if he could send me his notes, so he just sent me his PowerPoint. So I have edited some of his PowerPoints and just straight up stealing some of the stuff that he sent to me for that he taught on April 21st, 2021. So I'm going to be going over that. So I really appreciate Donnie Rader sending that to me. The purpose of the book of Ruth is to trace the lineage of Perez, Judah's son, to David through Boaz and Obed. So you have Judah, who has son Perez by way of Tamar, which is his daughter-in-law, but has Perez and then gets all the way to David. The time period is the time period of the Judges. So we don't exactly know when in the book of Judges this story takes place. There are different guesses. It's not, could be as late as the time of Eli, it could be earlier on in the book. But we know that it was written probably during the time of David, because David is specifically mentioned in the book. that it was actually penned later, that it doesn't mention any of the other kings after David, doesn't mention Solomon. So we know that good guess is that it was written during the time of David. We don't know exactly who it is that wrote it. And it's one of the two books in the Old Testament named after a woman. Esther is about a Jew who marries a Gentile, and Ruth is about a Gentile who marries a Jew. The Moabites, they are the descendants of Lot. You remember in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and his two daughters escape. Lot's wife perishes. They think they're the only people left on the face of the earth. So they said, well, we got to get our father drunk. And they have an inappropriate relationship with their father. And from that, they have Moab and Edom. And from them, all of the Moabites and the Edomites. So this story is a love story, shows love, calm, and loyalty in midst of war and hate. And it begins with a funeral and ends with a wedding. So here are the descendants of Judah as they're written out. You have Judah had different sons, and they all pass away, and they were all married at one point to Tamar. And then Judah was like, well, she's widowed all of my sons so far, and she wasn't willing to wait for to have another kid to be a wife for Tamar. So Tamar tricks him into thinking that she's a prostitute and sleeps with her father-in-law. From that union, you have Perez. Through him all the way down, you get to Boaz, Obed, and Jesse. Boaz is the person that we're talking about in this story is going to marry Ruth. So it's through these descendants you have David and ultimately the lineage of Jesus himself. Here is the location of Moab. Moab is this darker orange section. Of course, everything on the it is on the bottom right-hand corner of the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea. Land of Canaan is over on the left side of that map. If you're going to break down one of the commentaries, Warren Wiersbe's commentaries breaks it down in these 4 ways. Chapter 1 is about Ruth's sorrow, Ruth's service, Ruth's surrender, and Ruth's satisfaction. Those 4 chapters in order. Might be a little bit of a stretch on some of them, but really chapter 1 is more about Naomi's sorrow, where she becomes, not only loses her husband, loses where she lives, where she grows up, moving to the land of Moab. She also loses both of her sons. So that is what happens in chapter 1. You see Naomi makes a decision, well, Naomi's husband at least, their family, Elimelech, and their 2 sons. There's a famine in the land of Canaan. This again is sometime during the time of the Judges. Some of the worst time spiritually for the children of Israel. Remember, we talked about how there was this cycle of the Judges that people would be somewhat religious towards God, but then would drift off into idolatry, and then God would send an army or plague or something, and the people would cry out, so God would send a deliverer, and he would deliver the people from the enemies, and then they would be faithful again, and then they would get lazy again, and they would fall into sin again, and God would punish them, and they would cry out, God would send a deliverer, and then they would be faithful again. Except we talked how they were never quite as faithful the next time around. It's like making a copy of a copy. It's never quite as good as the original. Said it's more like a toilet bowl than it is. It's just a continual decline of spirituality. And in this book, we're going to see just some evidence of that there's going to be a lot of loyalty and faithfulness from this Moabite woman, from this foreigner, loyalty towards her mother-in-law, And then ultimately we see Boaz is an incredible character during these dark days, being so emphatic of keeping God's law the way that he was supposed to. It really is a shining character during the time of the judges. So in chapter 1, you see them move to Moab. And when they're in Moab, her children, her sons, marry Moabite women. This was something that was forbidden under the law. You weren't supposed to marry foreigners, but they did. But then Elimelech and then the two sons passed away. So now Naomi is a widow. What does she call herself, or want to be called? Mara is actually my sister's name. My sister, who was visiting just here on Sunday, her name is Mara, but in a different language it means eternally beautiful, I think is what she says anyway. But it's a name, not bitter, but the Mara means bitter. Here we have Naomi having to deal with a situation. Was it her fault that her husband and her kids died? There's no indication of that. Do bad things happen sometimes where you're put into a sorrowful situation? Absolutely. Like Job. Yeah, Job was put into a difficult situation that was beyond his control. But what's the difference between Job and Naomi? Naomi goes into a very bitter state. Job has some struggles with that as well. How much can you fault Naomi for being bitter and being this level of sad and depressed? I mean, it would be a very, very difficult situation for anybody. Being a widow in a foreign land with nothing, no one to care for her, to provide for her, she can't provide for herself. There's just a lot of seemingly an impossible situation. So it's just her and her two daughters-in-law. And so what does she say to... You had a comment? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, to her credit, she does say to her daughters-in-law, may the Lord provide for you, may the Lord deal kindly with you. Even though later in the chapter she says, the Lord has turned his hand against me, she still sees him as sovereign.
Absolutely. So she sees that God is in control. And it's interesting the different statements that she has about the Lord in these chapters. So it starts with the Lord... hoping that the Lord will bless, but what the Lord has done for me is that she is in a depressed state. May the Lord grant each of you rest in the house of a new husband. She tells them in verse 8, go back to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness and show that as you have shown to the dead and to me. Let's see. She says, where is it? She tells them to go back to their gods as well. To go back to their own home, to their own family, marry somebody else, establish your household, go back to your own gods. But in 15... Yes, in verse 15, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Follow your sister-in-law. Would you consider this good advice from Naomi? Does Naomi, she's in a very bitter state. So how much, this would be a very, very difficult situation to be in. But tells them, go back to your own gods. When she's supposed to believe in the one true God. But here, in verse 16, you have Ruth's reply. In verse 16, don't plead with me to abandon you or return and not follow you, for wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. I don't know how long Ruth had been part of their family, but back in verse 4, they had been living in Moab about 10 years. So she had been part of Naomi's family somewhere less than 10 years. But sometime in that time had grown such an attachment to her mother-in-law and showed such loyalty. In verse 16 and verse 17, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me and do so severely if anything but death separates you and me. And when Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped talking to her. The two of them traveled until they came to Bethlehem. When they entered Bethlehem, the whole town was excited about their arrival, and the local women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara," she answered, "for the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has oppressed me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" So Naomi came back from the territory of Moab with her daughter-in-law Ruth, the Moabitess. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. There's a theme that you're going to notice throughout this section is that she is going to be pointed out as the Moabitess over and over and over and over and over again. It's almost like they don't want you to forget that she is a foreigner, that she isn't from around these parts. And part of Jewish law was how you are supposed to treat the foreigner who was among you. Now, were they supposed to marry foreigners? But how were they supposed to treat foreigners? Under the law of Moses, there are three types of oppressed people that are talked about over and over and over again. It's the orphan, the widow, and the sojourner. The foreigner, the traveler, the person that's coming through your land. And what are you supposed to do for the sojourner, the traveler that's coming through your land? That you're supposed to, hey, if food naturally falls on the ground, when you're harvesting your crop, you don't pick up the stuff off of the ground. That is for the widow and for the foreigner to pick up. You weren't supposed to harvest from the edge of your crops. Those were for generosity to widows and foreigners and for people who were in need, that they could get some food from what you grow. That God is very interested in caring for the foreigner and the widow. And to me, this should carry over into our own just views today about who Christians should be caring for. Those who cannot care for themselves. We are to be generous to those who can't care for themselves. That is chapter 1 of kind of the situation of how all of this is being set up. When we move into chapter 2, we don't see God's hand miraculously changing things in the world where all of a sudden there was a mountain there one day and there wasn't a mountain there the next day. That there's no miracles that happen in the book of Ruth, but what we do see all over the place is providence. That God pulling the strings from behind the scenes, moving things to be exactly the way that he wants them to be. So in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side. He was a prominent man of noble character from Elimelech's family. His name was Boaz. Ruth, the Moabitess, again we're told that she's a foreigner. Ruth the Moabitess asked Naomi, "Will you let me go into the fields and gather fallen grain behind someone with whom I find favor?" Naomi answered her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So Ruth left and entered the field to gather grain behind the harvesters. She happened to be in the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was from Elimelech's family. Later, when Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, he said to the harvesters, "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they replied. Boaz asked his servant, "Who is in charge of the harvesters? Whose young woman is this?" The servant answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the territory of Moab." She asked, "Will you let me gather fallen grain from among the bundles behind the harvesters?" She came and has been on her feet since early morning, except that she rested a little in the shelter. What do you see from Ruth so far in this section? Yeah. And who is she also going to help? Naomi. She is going to be the breadwinner. Where is she getting this food from? Yeah, where is the food coming from? From God's provision in the law. It was the grain that was where? Yeah, behind the harvesters, the grain that had fallen on the ground. Now, Boaz had people he had hired to be harvesters for him. And were they following God's law about letting fallen grain fall to the ground and not reaching down and picking it up? They were doing what God had told them to do. And here you see Boaz being a man who follows God's law. And Naomi has sent Ruth, and Ruth is gathering up the stuff that has been fallen down. Now, Boaz notices her. I don't know if Moabite women would have looked significantly different. Maybe it was very clear that she was a foreigner right off the bat. I don't know how much different she would have looked. Yeah.
Well, remember, Bethlehem's very small.
Yes.
So it might just be there's a new person in town.
Yes, that's also true. So just a new person in town. Who is this woman? And it's the woman that came back with Naomi from Moab. So, and what has she been doing all day? She's been walking, she's been working, she's been diligent. She's not someone who is lazy. So, Boaz speaks directly to her in verse 8. Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter, don't go and gather grain in another field, and don't leave this one, but stay here close to my female servants. See which field they are harvesting, and follow them. Haven't I ordered the young men not to touch you? When you are thirsty, go and drink from the jars the young men have filled." She fell face down, bowed to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor with you, so that you notice me, although I am a foreigner?" Again, what is the attitude that she recognizes is that she's a foreigner living in Judea. How do people typically treat foreigners is different than the way Boaz is treating a foreigner. I think there's a lesson for us in that as well. Boaz answered her, "Everything you have done for your mother-in-law since your husband's death has been fully reported to me, how you left your father and your mother and your native land, how you came to a people you didn't previously know. May the Lord reward you for what you have done, and may you receive a full reward from the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." This is an incredible statement. What does Boaz say about Ruth? What does he know about her? Evidently quite a bit. He's heard of her reputation. How is her reputation right now? Very good. That's going to come up in chapter 3. Her reputation, as well as Boaz's, we'll come to that later. So Boaz shows great kindness to Ruth. There may be an indication here that there was war in the land at the time. He's saying, hey, there's danger out there. You stay close to my servants. I've ordered the men not to touch you. They're going to protect you. You drink from the water that they bring to my workers. You just essentially don't need to worry. What kind of a relief would that have been for her? Be an incredible relief. And how she replies, she just falls face down and bows to the ground and says, "Why are you so kind to me?" And it's because of her reputation, of how loyal she has been to her mother-in-law when she didn't need to be. You've come to this foreign land to take care of your mother-in-law. He values that in her. And so Absolutely. He's noticed all of those things. And when the mealtime comes in verse 14, he invites her to eat with him and the rest of the harvesters. And she ate and was satisfied, had some left over. She got up to gather grain. Boaz orders the young men, make sure you drop enough grain for her to have. And she goes home with quite a bit. She gathers, it was about 26 quarts of barley. My translation goes ahead and translates that. You know how big a quart jar is. Is a pretty good size jar. So she's going home with 26 quart jars of barley. That's way more than enough you would need to eat in one day. That would provide her to maybe trade for other stuff that she would need to go with it to make the barley bread and to provide for her and for Naomi. So she picks up the grain, goes into town, sees her mother-in-law, and Naomi asks, so where were you gathering today? And she says, I met this really nice guy named Boaz. And how does Naomi respond to that? Yeah, he's a relative. And not only that may the Lord bless him because he has not abandoned the kindness of the living and the dead. Here's another time where Naomi talks about God, that God, she had wished well to her daughters-in-law. The Lord has dealt harshly with her, has opposed me, but now the Lord has blessed us. May the Lord bless him. And the man is a close relative. He is one of our family redeemers. What does that mean? You know?
To start a new, with God,
Yeah, so in the law of Moses, very good. In the law of Moses, if a man dies and leaves a widow and family, and this is part of his inheritance that was given during the time of Joshua, that they divided the land is supposed to stay in certain families forever. And that land is supposed to be passed down. But if a man dies, doesn't leave an heir, what happens to his land? It doesn't just get auctioned off to anybody. It's supposed to stay in that guy's family, that whoever his widow is, by law, is supposed to marry the family redeemer so that they can bring up heirs for that family line to continue so that land could stay in the family. That was part of the law.
This is a question you might need to answer later for me. Is the Avenger of Blood and the Kinsman Redeemer, would those end up being the same person?
I don't know. It very well could be. I don't know.
I know it's a different purpose, but it's still
Yeah.
protecting the family.
Yeah. So he's going to be one of the Redeemer. So they continue until the barley harvest and the wheat harvest are finished. She lives with her mother-in-law. So some time passes there towards the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3, Ruth's surrender. She's going to, again, it's another kind of a stretch just to make all of the S words work. Naomi is going to have some advice for Ruth. The first thing that she's going to advise is say, hey, for us to really survive and thrive, we need to invoke this family redeemer policy of the law. So you need to strip your widow garments and show yourself to be available to be married again. And so they come up with this idea that Naomi says, my daughter, shouldn't I find rest for you so that you will be taken care of? Isn't Boaz our relative? Haven't you been working with his female servants? This evening he will be winnowing the barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfumed oil, wear your best clothes, go down to the threshing floor. Don't let the men know you're there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, notice the place where he's lying. Go in and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will explain to you what you should do. So Ruth said to her, I will do everything as you say. She went into the threshing floor, did everything her mother-in-law had charged her to do. After Boaz ate, drank, and was in good spirits, he went to lie down at the end of the pile of barley. She came secretly, uncovered his feet, and laid down. At midnight, Boaz was startled, turned over, and there lying at his feet was a woman. So he asked, "Who are you?" "I am Ruth, your servant," she replied. "Take me under your wing, for you are a family redeemer." Then he said, "May the Lord bless you, my daughter. You have shown me more kindness now than before, because you have not pursued younger men, whether rich or poor. Now don't be afraid, my daughter. I will do for you whatever you say, since all the people in my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Yes, it is true that I am a family redeemer, but there is a redeemer closer than I am. Stay here tonight, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem you, that's good. Let him redeem you. If he doesn't want to redeem you, as the Lord lives, I will. Now lie down until the morning." So she lay down at his feet until morning. She got up while it was still dark. Then Boaz says, "Don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor." He told Ruth, "Bring the shawl you are wearing and hold it out." When she held it out, he shoveled 6 measures of barley into her shawl, and she went into the town. So she went to Naomi, who asked what happened. My daughter, then Ruth told her everything the man had done for her. "He gave me these 6 measures of barley because he said, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" We'll pause there for a second. She does what Naomi tells her to do, goes to Boaz. And when he goes to sleep, she uncovers his feet, takes his shoes off, and lays down. And then he's startled about midnight. This is not any type of sensual encounter. In fact, he is going to praise her for just the opposite, of being someone of a noble character, and that everybody knows that she has a noble character. When he says when she says in verse 9, "I am Ruth, your servant," she says, "You are a family redeemer," and she wants to be married to Boaz. By this indication, there's a good chance that Boaz was significantly older than Ruth. Boaz says, "You could go after a younger man, someone that's better looking than me." Essentially, whether rich, whether poor, you could go after that sensuality, physical attraction, those types of things, but yet you're showing me this kind of kindness in the way that you have approached me about this. So don't be afraid. Now, there is somebody that's a closer relative. We'll go talk to him. If he won't redeem you, don't worry. I will, and I will take care of you, and we will do as the law has instructed. That his noble character is such. And not only that, when she gets up in the middle of the night while it's still dark and is about to leave, what does he tell her? Yeah, before that, he tells her, "Don't leave yet. Don't leave while it's still dark." Why? Okay, possibly it could be because it wasn't safe, but also, what's that? Yeah, absolutely. Nothing happened. There was nothing sensual that happened, but he doesn't want her to be seen leaving the threshing floor in the middle of the night while it's still dark. It would protect her reputation as well as his own. He is very protective of her reputation. Everybody knows what kind of a character you have. You don't want to mar that. And he sends her away with a gift. Then they go through the process of the family redeemer, and the other man didn't want to risk his own inheritance. There's speculation about exactly what that means. The real answer is I don't know. There's some guesses out there. We talk about that, but we're running out of time. At the end, Ruth marries Boaz, and they have a son. And this son, Obed, brings Naomi great joy. The woman who was so full of bitterness, that bitterness has been removed and now she has been made full. So some just for the last few minutes, some practical lessons from these chapters. When blessings do come, recognize that it is from God. Back in chapter 1, verse 6, when all of these bad things happen, when there's a famine and they go to the land of Moab, and then their sons marry these foreign women, and then everybody dies, you just don't understand how that kind of tragedy could lead to anything that is good. But Ruth is someone that is good, and a good that happens in Naomi's life. Things don't always go as we plan. We can plan to do all sorts of things, but bad things can happen. The being dedicated to the people that you love, you definitely see that from Ruth in this. The great kindness and loyalty. You see God providence throughout this entire book. That there is good in the midst of turmoil. How God is called a refuge and He is always a place of safety for us. You see how attitudes can change based on circumstances and things. When things are bitter, there may be a hidden blessing. In chapter 3 and chapter 4, you have a lot more lessons that we can bring out. Just the faith and courage it took for Ruth to approach Boaz as she did would have been very intimidating to go and do that. And this idea of a kinsman redeemer is a type of Christ, how we are redeemed by someone who didn't, we deserve the penalty that is coming to us, but Christ redeems us from that. Again, you see great kindness, the willingness to obey the Levitical law, and the emphasis on remaining pure and showing your purity, that she could have gone after younger men, could have gone after sensual things, but yet she is more interested in being loyal to her mother-in-law and doing the right thing. And God blesses them. The protection of her reputation as well as Boaz's reputation is definitely evident in this. The modesty in the action of where she goes to the threshing floor, and the way she acts is a way that Boaz very much appreciates. And then in chapter 4, the first part, where Boaz calls witnesses of the elders to come and witness, there's going to be a decision made. Either this guy is going to redeem the family, or I'm going to redeem the family. Either way, there is going to be a thing happen today, and we need to have witnesses, and there's certainly value in having witnesses. And then the ratification and binding of nature of agreement, they have that agreement fully established. And then the family love that we have in verse 15, that chapter 4, He will renew your life, sustain your old age. Indeed, your daughter-in-law who loves you is better to you than 7 sons has given birth to him. That Naomi is refreshed because of the love that she has in her family now. All right, that is a very brief overview of the book of Ruth. Anybody have any comments or questions on this book? Okay.
Why the feet? Why did she uncover the feet?
No, I don't know. It seems to be an act of service in some way, that it's a take care of me and I will care for you type thing. I don't know for certain.
Was it normal in those days for the women to comb through there?
No, it would not have been normal for that. No. All right. Well, next week, Lynn will be back next Wednesday afternoon, but we also have a guy from Tennessee that is coming to be with us. Perry Hall is coming for a couple of days, going to be helping me with some campus evangelism. I'm going to be passing out cards for the gospel meeting. Want anybody who's able to come out, you're most welcome anytime on pretty much all day Wednesday, and then for just a couple hours on Thursday morning, we'll have people out, or we'll be out there doing some evangelism in the community, on campus. So we're more the merrier for that. And then, but since he'll be here on Wednesday night, we've asked Perry to go ahead and speak for us as well. He is a preacher of the gospel, and I'm not exactly sure what he's going to speak on, but my guess it will be something in the evangelism sphere. So we're hope everybody will be able to be here for that. So, yeah. Not yet. If you have suggestions, I'm up. I've got. There's a list of like 6 or 7 places on campus that are good for this in different green spaces. So.
I'm going to ask you, y'all talked to anybody there about getting permission?
Yes, I have. So I talked to the people that is in charge of that type of thing, and SEMO has some of the friendliest laws and rules and regulations when it comes to free speech areas. They like for you to let them know ahead of time, just so they can say, hey, there's already a group that plans to be out there, or we already have an event on this one this day, so it'd be better for you to go to one of the other spaces. But there's no like requirement that you have to let them know even. You can just set up and go and set up and do your thing. But
That's good, 'cause not all colleges are that way.
no. Where Perry goes a lot is at Vol State in Gallatin, and they have it's because there's a guy there that just yells at people, from what I understand, and so he's kind of ruined it for everyone. That you have to give a 2-week advance notice of when you're coming, and they have 2 ropes set up, and you have to stay inside the inside rope, and they have to stay outside the outside rope. And you can hand stuff over the ropes, but that's as close as you can get to people. But you have to stay inside the ropes, and only on one spot on campus. So SEMO's a lot freer when it comes to that, which I'm very thankful for. All right, that's all I've got. I'll turn it over to Mark.
Alrighty, 292. If it's where you can, let's all stand. We'll sing this. The Lord